Welcome to the Rainmaker Podcast, a show for people who are obsessed with all things marketing. I'm your host, Veronica, Romney, certified master marketer, international keynote speaker, workshop facilitator, and the author of a new book called Identity Marketing. Each week, I interview rainmakers from brands big and small to pull back the curtain on what's actually working in marketing today. We dig into real-life wins and losses and their very real consequences, and get into spicy discussions of marketing controversies and opposing philosophies. This is the real marketing thought leadership you've been looking for in your ears on demand. This is the Rainmaker Podcast. Welcome back to the Rainmaker Podcast. Ooh, this next guest, it's a good one, you guys. First of all, he's worked with freaking everybody. He's worked with Mark Randolph, who's one of the co-creators of Netflix, Gabby Bernstein, Jay Shetty, Mel Robbins, then big brands like the American Red Cross, and then some. This man has worked with everybody. He's a personal branding expert because he's earned that right. And he's also refreshingly honest about where he despises what he does and he's over what he's doing in some regards. And he's on to the next evolution. Our guest, Son E, is like, he's just refreshing and kind and honest. And we were introduced by a mutual friend, and he's going to be on this podcast talking to you. Yes, things personal branding, but also we got into a really meaty conversation around like the difference between branding someone who's a knowledge expert versus a knowledge broker that I think you're really going to appreciate. So without giving too many spoilers, please welcome my guest, Son E. Son, welcome to the Rainmaker Podcast.
Welcome, everyone.
Yeah. Okay,
Thank you
I
for
have to
having
be
me.
honest. You fascinate me, sir. Full disclosure, let me just put it out there and be authentic and honest myself. When I was like studying your past as a rainmaker that you are fascinating to me because you break all the rules in the path of your success. And so I want to start with like, where did that actually come from? Is that a nature or a nurture? Like, is that something that your
I
family
think it's
taught you, or is
nature.
that just who you are?
I strongly believe in nurture. I think so between nature and nurture, I feel like nature is what gives you kind of like the personality,
Mm-hmm.
and nurture is what like extends that, right? So I think like maybe you're born an introvert, and then like nurture is what you can make the most out of that or something. Like maybe you have this talent, but without nurture, maybe you might just be lazy and do nothing. But without the right nurture, maybe you would take that talent and push it somewhere or something like that. So I hugely believe in nurture, but the reason why I say nature is because, when you said like I break all the rules, like I've been like that my whole life. And my sister is actually the opposite. She's a goody two-shoe, and we were raised obviously in the same house.
Mm-hmm.
So like I've always been like I moved out of my house as soon as like high school was over. My sister still kind of like goes back home every summer. She's a professor, but she's like very much still like a goody two-shoe in the family, whereas and maybe that kind of gave me the freedom to do whatever I want. But I've always been like I always tell people that like I don't have my own opinions. I don't believe in anything. My belief is whatever is the opposite of yours.
So this is really interesting to me because some of my favorite marketing is where we see people like punch the prevailing wisdom in the throat. Some people say challenge conventional wisdom. I'm more Latina, so I am a little bit spicier. I'm like, well, no, you're punching the prevailing wisdom in the throat. That's what you did. And funny, one of my favorite parts on your website, because it's great copy, where you're like, yeah, I was chasing my why for years and was super unhappy. And then when I gave up chasing my why, I became happier. And I was like, talk to me about that. That was such great copy.
Yeah, I mean, and that's like a huge part of like, I think the biggest kind of belief change that I've had in my life. Like throughout your life, you have these like
paradigm shift.
Yeah. And one of the biggest ones for me is that if I look back at everything that I've achieved, I achieved it accidentally. Like, I love this quote by Paul Rand. He's like a logo designer. Like he's like I'm sure you know. But he said, don't try to be original, just try to be good. Right. And that's like always been the case for me. Like everything that I did, I just try to do the good job in what's in front of me without really thinking about the future or anything like that. And somehow magically it just led to different opportunities. And if I try to plan it, like I could have never planned where I was going to be. Like if I'm like, this is my purpose, like even what I'm doing right now, you know, I'm teaching storytelling. Like if you asked me 5 years ago, that son, like you're going to be teaching storytelling to, you know, to a group of people on the internet or whatever it is, I'm going to be like, what? Like, shut up. What are you talking about? You know what I mean? Like 5 years ago, I was like a full-time agency owner working on client projects and things like that. So, yeah.
This is what's interesting to me. I did an Instagram live earlier today with this woman named Kathy Hiller. I don't know if you know who she is.
Yeah.
She's like, you know, all about abundance and spirituality and things like that. But she, in her conversation, she was talking about like there's a difference between understanding your assignment or understanding the mission in the moment and then being attached with the outcome or the result. And so it's interesting to me because I see that in you where you're like, I'm going to do the best job with the thing present in front of me, being detached from what will come of it tomorrow, the next day, or the next day. It's very few people that can do that, that can hold space for being good at being present and where their feet are, and then also not letting drive or ambition take away from that presence. How do you do that?
I
It's
don't think
very
I'm
rare
good
to
at it.
me.
It's like
No?
actually,
Okay.
I actually think that's my biggest struggle. It's like literally every day, 5 times a day, I have to constantly remind myself
Okay.
like to let go of the outcome and let go, like, because like I find myself doing that even in my community. Like I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, I need to do this and I need to make the process like this, and like I need to make it about, we're all about this, and I try to plan how our community will evolve, and like and then I have to kind of like slap myself and be like, son, wait, you're not going to plan anything, right? Just like go with what your intuition tells you right now. And I think that's like the key. Like for me, it's like I don't have like some grand plan, 5-year plan, even like 1-year plan. Like I just kind of I think over time, you like, you know, kind of like when you watch like when you sit home and watch Netflix and eat pizza, right? Like even
Yeah.
though that might feel good, like somewhere inside you have this anxiety of like, oh, I should be doing
Yes.
this or something like
Yeah.
that, right? And then there are certain times when you're like on a podcast or when you're making content, you're like, you know, it just like drives you and you're like, it's so feels so meaningful and like somewhere deep inside. But at the same time, like if let's say I've been working nonstop for 2 weeks so hard, all in, and after that, if I'm sitting all day and watching Netflix and eating pizza, I'm not going to have that anxiety. So somehow like we intuitively know
Yeah.
what's the thing that we should be doing right now
Yeah.
that leads you to the right direction or not. Like it's so as long as I think we just listen to that, I think that is for me, that's my 5-year plan. Just
Well, yeah, your 5-year plan is intuition, which is not a bad plan. But it's interesting to me because I think you are. I think I find you to be a bold personal brand. Like even your social media content is kind of intoxicating because you're constantly kind of punching prevailing wisdom in every post or every carousel. But then I mean, certainly in your agency experience, but you've accompanied other big brands, other big voices, whether it's Jay Shetty or Mel Robbins or whoever. Um, what is that like? How does one strong perspective in a service provider capacity serve another strong voice perspective in the space? This is what I think is always fascinating when you're working with big personal brands, at least for me in my
yeah,
experience with them.
I agree. I think it's too. So I always thought that like, oh, I go online and I started on 2020, like putting out content, my own content, and trying to build my own personal brand. I'm like, oh, it's gonna be the same thing. It's like whatever I'm talking to whatever the marketing stuff I'm doing, copywriting, blah, blah, I'll just talk about the same thing. But like I realized like it's vastly different. Like now what I always say is like when somebody some social media marketer says like, oh, you know, I do all of these things for my client. Like I don't have to, like, just because I don't have followers on my account doesn't mean that I don't know how to do it. Well, I guarantee you it's different because I always
Mm-hmm.
thought I was good in social media and I can grow like any account. until I started growing my own account, I realized it's a totally different thing when you're speaking for yourself versus when you're, like you said, the broker speaking for some. Yeah. And at the end of the day, when you know, this is one of the reasons why I'm kind of trying to step away from my agency business, is when you're an agency, when you're a service provider, when you're a freelancer doing work for someone else, at the end of the day, you're a service provider. You're not talking about your own opinions. You got to kill your ego a little bit. Your goal is not to try to, you know, push your own design ideas and push your own agenda. Like, your goal is to serve the client. And I don't, for me, like in the beginning, I didn't know that. So I used to, in the first like couple of years of my business, I used to argue with my clients a lot. Like,
that's awesome.
I used to be like, no, I'm not going to do that. Like, that's wrong. But then eventually what I realized is that actually I couldn't really enjoy running an agency or being a service provider until I made it my goal, my purpose to serve the client. My goal is to serve that client as best as I can. And once I put all my energy on them, and like, you're the hero, you're the Batman, I'm just the Robin. That's when things started. I actually started enjoying it. I started enjoying being Robin. You know?
Yeah, because you weren't competing. So, and I think that certainly does happen sometimes when you have strong personality service providers with strong personality clients. It becomes, or even internally in a team. Like, think about the dynamics in a team when you have leaders. It's so harmful when there's competition amongst leaders versus, you know, energetic counsel, like counseling sessions where you're like, you know. This is actually how I discovered that I was meant to be a visionary more than an integrator, because I had always identified as like the integrator personality. I'm so good behind the scenes. I'm so good being the architect of the team, or I just love it, running the machine. But then it was the 4 a.m. wake up calls with my own visions, my own ideas, my own thoughts, and they would ultimately start to like compete or become an issue with the visionary that was supposed to be the visionary on deck that I didn't think was doing a good or an integral job. That's when I always got caught, is when I felt the visionary wasn't serving with integrity. And then I had my own strong opinion. So it's just really interesting how I discovered who I was in respect to working with others.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, like, why did you step away from the whole agency business, like the agency business, and I guess
sold it. Yeah.
There's the answer.
I sold it. Well, so I had an agent. This is how I left corporate. Was I started the agency before I even put in my 2 weeks notice or whatever, as a backup, you know, as a pure backup. And then when it took off, I couldn't obviously hold both and do a good job. But we sold the agency summer of 2019, right before the pandemic. So the timing was great. But I had gotten to a place where they worked with me because they respected me, and they usually saw me speak on stage. That's how I got a lot of our clients, is I would go and do a lot of speaking engagements because I love that so deeply. And I get on stage and I, you know, do all the things, and then they'd want to work with me. And then as soon as they signed the contract, it was like the power dynamic shifted immediately from being a form of respect or partnership or admiration. It was like I had to make up for all the past agencies that had done them dirty. I was being treated badly as if I was the ex-boyfriend that hurt them. It was really interesting how much they treated me and my staff almost degradingly sometimes, just because we were the service provider. And I got really tired of that after a couple of years of doing it.
Yeah, I don't think that ever truly goes away. I always thought, like, I remember like getting American Red Cross as a client, right? I'm like, oh, this is it. Like, from now on, nobody's gonna look down on us, right? And then same thing. Like, once I started working with Gabby Bernstein, and then once we got like Mel Robbins, I'm like, okay, this is it. Like, nobody's gonna look down. Like, it kept happening. But I think that as long as you're a service provider, at the end of the day, you're a service provider. Like, it doesn't matter how much, like, you know, here's the thing. Like, when I was like working as a designer at an agency, I'm like, oh, I can't wait to freelance so I can make my own decisions. Blah, blah, blah. Once I started freelancing, I was like, oh, I can't wait till like I have my own agency so I can make, you know, I can just get the clients that I want, right? The big clients, and then they'll let me do whatever I want. And Like it just kept going up and up and like winning awards and blah, blah, blah. But that day where I can just do whatever I want never came. Like it's at the end of the day, if you're a service provider,
you're
like
a service provider.
I say this, at the end of the day, I'm a servant. I'm a slave to the client. That's what I am. And you have, and actually like, that's why I shifted my mind. I said, I have to actually enjoy being the slave. Like, for example, like if you're a parent, you're a slave to your kids. Like if you have young kids, right? Well, but you love being a slave to your kids, and it's almost like that. Like you almost have to love that. And if you can't love that, I don't think you should be in service.
Stay in that position. Yeah. Yeah, and it's true. Yeah, I think you're 100% right. And I think when you are amongst a group of service providers behind the scenes, these are very similar conversations that we're having with like in honest talk. This is how we share, and this is the grief, this is the heartache that we're experiencing, is that no matter how much mastery we've earned or how many things that we've done to achieve respect, at the end of the day, the power dynamic is such that you will always never be equal, truly. And that's difficult, especially if you are a stronger personality with really strong opinions. It's hard. So I chose to not do that anymore.
I would say like, ultimately I've gotten to a point where it was 50-50. Like 50% of my clients, I was the expert. And it was like, the power dynamic was more like either equal or I was actually coaching them, right? Like, where they would go with my opinion. So, but then like, but that's after us basically becoming the top personal branding agency in New York. Like, if we can't do that, if only 50% of our clients, that means other agencies, they're fucked. Like because the other 50%, I still had to be their slave. Like they still didn't care, So yes, to a certain degree, yes, but not completely.
I want to talk to you about something because I feel like you're like the perfect person to have this conversation with because of the nature of the work that you've done, because of the clients that you've worked with. And you do not have to name clients in this next conversation or segment. This has been bothering me, son. Let me just vent. I'm going to vent. Like, I also work with some personal clients, and I've worked for them as a W-2 employee. I've worked with them as a service provider, as a consultant in different roles. But ultimately, I've worked with some really large personal brands, and I've seen behind the scenes, right behind the curtain of the Wizard of Oz. What I keep coming back to is that there's two different types of individuals. There's the knowledge expert, and then there's the knowledge broker. The expert is the person that figured out how to do something that nobody else had done, or figured out how to do something in a way that nobody else had done, right? Like they have the IP, they have the original
I see what you mean,
structure thing that can be packaged that's invaluable. Like the Brene Browns, like she did her research, she published the paper, she earned that weight around vulnerability and shame, right? And then there's the brokers, right? Like when I think of like Tools of Titans with Tim Ferriss, or even any of Tony Robbins' books that have like anything to do with
like
finances.
Lewis House,
they're not experts, but they curate and they broker other people's expertise, and then they do the work to package it so that we can consume it. Both knowledge expert and knowledge broker are extremely successful and wildly lucrative personal brands. I have lots of examples that I can share. But then like going in and being in the room with them, I think how you market them or how you brand them is a little bit different. I'm curious your perspective on this. Like when you're working with an expert versus a broker, how do you approach their personal branding?
Okay, so I didn't realize what you meant by expert versus broker, but now I'm very clear. And now that you're saying it, I feel like almost majority of them are brokers, not experts. There's very few experts. And maybe experts are the ones who has done something first.
Yeah.
Like maybe brokers are the ones who study something and then they teach what they studied, versus like, for example, we work with Mark Randolph, who's the founder of Netflix. So to me, he's an expert. right? He's actually done it himself, and he's teaching based on his experience. And then Jay Shetty, somebody like Jay Shetty, I think to me he's a broker, because what he's doing, like with his podcast and stuff like that, what he's doing is he's talking to experts and he's reteaching that information, basically, right? In terms of marketing them, you know, it's kind of like, you know, what's a little bit sad is like, I don't think it doesn't matter whether you're expert or not. Like, I think your expertise has almost nothing to do with how successful you're going to be as a brand.
Tell me why do you say that?
Because Jay Shetty is way more successful in his personal brand than, for example, Mark Randolph. Even though Mark Randolph, you know, co-founded Netflix. Like, you know, so, and I've seen this over and over and over again so many times. You know what I mean? Because I honestly don't think that, like, and I think it's probably same in business too, right? Like, the companies that are the most successful are not necessarily the ones that make the best products. It's usually the one that does the best marketing. And I think I think it's like, I think Jay Shetty is just a much better marketer than Mark Randolph. And this is another thing that I realize is that I like to believe that, oh yeah, like it's because of, you know, not our agency that Jay Shetty is successful, Mel Robbins successful, Gary, like, but it's not, because we have plenty of clients that we work with that are not successful. Do you know what I mean? So it's as much as we like to believe that it's us, at the end of the day, some people are just, you know, here's one thing that I noticed. Jay Shetty, Mel Robbins, to me, they're natural born marketers. Like, they don't even, like, we actually, as marketers behind the scenes, like us, usually, most of the time, we're the ones that are like faking it, actually. We went to marketing school. We're the person that are not natural marketer, like natural born marketers that learned marketing. I hear you. Right? Jay Shetty doesn't have to go to marketing school. He doesn't need to take any courses. He's just a natural born marketer because he understands what the mainstream audience wants. And it's kind of like, and it's so, and the smartest people that I know actually have no idea what the mainstream audience wants. You know what I mean? Like, they just, they know what they want. So like, here's a typical like conversation that I have with people when I tell people to like dumb down their content. Like, and I can't, it's so hard for me to get my clients to like dumb down their content and just like make it more mainstream, right? Make it more cliche, because at the end of the day, that's what people want. That's what's going to do well. And they're like, no, I don't want to sound cliche. I don't want to sound like everybody else, you know, boring, or anyone else. Like, that's one thing, right? But I think Jay Shetty understands that. So like, if you look at his like kind of, if you look at his old videos of like, oh, you know, this homeless man who like telling those like cliche stories, like when I watch them, they're so cringe. But obviously they work because they get millions of views. You know what I mean? And so he understands that he has no problem stooping down to that level, right? And
okay, but hold on, because that brings up the integrity question. That brings up the ethics question. Does that then also mean that in order to be successful in the personal brand game at the scale that you and I are talking about, you have to essentially be a sellout? Like, you have to, I mean, to some degree, you know, right? Like,
there's a Jay-Z song called Moment of Clarity, where he goes,
I love that you're quoting Jay-Z right now. Go ahead.
Yeah, there's a part where he goes like, I dumb down for the audience and double my dollar. And he talks about like, he talks about another rapper named Common. And Common he's a much better lyricist than, even Jay-Z considers him a better rapper than him. But he's not nearly as successful as Jay-Z.
Yeah.
And I think there's something about being able to live in that fine line between like the mainstream success versus art. And if you look at like a lot of, like, if you look at movies like Christopher Nolan's like Dark Knight, right? Or some, like, if you look at like movies like that, those are masterpieces, because not only, or like Fight Club or something like that, like not only because they're walking this fine line of like mainstream popularity, but it's also something that critics also would say is a masterpiece, right? So it's those are the true masterpieces when you can do both. I see a bunch of like Oscar movies that are like, that all the critics are saying, oh, this is a masterpiece, and I go watch it and I'm like, oh, what is
it's
this
terrible.
shit? Like,
yeah.
You know what I mean?
I agree. So how do you do that? How do you, or is that your responsibility in your agency? Like, how do you counsel, advise, help your clients find that line where it can be enough to appease the critics, but also be mass consumed by the non-critic, right? Like, how do you find that line for your clients, or is that not
I
your
guess I don't.
responsibility?
Yeah, I don't.
Yeah.
I don't. I'm. A lot of what I do is actually constantly telling them to do that, and then them fighting back against me, and it's like that push and pull.
Yeah.
Like, because I understand, because like even in my own content, it's hard for me to do that. You know what I mean? And I'm sure you would understand as a content creator too.
Of course.
It's not easy, but
yeah.
I guess I kind of stopped thinking about that. Now I just put out content, no matter how boring it is, how cliche it is, or whatever it is. Even if I've said it 100 times, I'll just put it out. And I've gotten to a point where I completely detach my ego from my content. Like back then, I'm like, oh, like, putting out this content, people would think this way about me, blah, blah, blah. Like, I don't think it's like, it's more robotic now. It's like I'm just putting out.
Do you think that you've detached yourself successfully because of some level of burnout? Like after so much content creation, after so much pieces out there, you're like, screw it.
That's a good point. Yeah. And it's that's actually exactly what happened with my agency too. Like in the first 3 years in my agency, I tried to do everything perfect. I'm like, we have to be agency known as this. And like, I try to like overcomplicate everything. And then 3 years later, I kind of burned out. I was like, whatever. I'm just like, now I'm just going into work every day, just doing the project as best as I can because I have a deadline for the client.
Yeah.
And that's actually when my agency really started taking off.
Yeah. This is why I don't know if I want to use the word envy, but this is why I admire people like the Taylor Swifts of the world, because she's always putting out a new body of content and like reinventing herself. And like that gift of reinvention that is novelty and dopamine and exciting. Like there was the Veronica that was the agency owner, and now there's the Veronica that's the book author, and then there's going to be the like it is kind of fun to reinvent yourself. And Jay Shetty is a really interesting example to me because he started with that humility of think like a monk, and that was kind of the whole thing, a different way of thinking, and now he's become like the love expert. I was like, oh, we're going to be the love expert now, and I'm sure a year from now, 2 years from now, he'll be something else. How do you get so huge and still remain so in tuned or attached to the commoner? Because that's the one thing, like I remember when I was in Rachel Hollis's heyday, I remember being in one of those stadiums that she would fill in Dallas, and I had my mom and I had my sister, and she put her goals on this like whiteboard on the big stage, and she's like, one of her top goals was to have a house in Hawaii like Oprah. And I was thinking, I'm like, damn, like for a brand that was built off of relatability and peeing her pants on the trampoline in her book, you wanting a big ass house in Hawaii is not relatable to everybody in this room. It'd be like the less than 1% of people. So how do the most successful brands, Mel Robbins, I think is a great example. She still feels so damn relatable to me. Sarah Blakely is another good example where I watch her content and I'm like, she's quirky and a mess. How do you, as big and large and as successful as these people get, how do they have such a great pulse on staying in tune with a commoner, with the relatable people?
That's probably like more a question for Jay Shetty, right? Like because I think, because when I met Mel Robbins and Jay Shetty, they weren't as, like when I first started working with Jay Shetty, when I met him, he was a nobody. He was like, because like I worked with Gabby first, and Jay Shetty was like a guest lecture on, like, they were friends, but at this point, Jay Shetty was not
Unknown.
yeah, he was unknown, right? But I would say even after he got big, he was pretty much the same person. And like, same thing, Mel Robbins. I mean, when I met Mel Robbins, she was, she had her TED Talk and stuff like that. But she wasn't as big as she is now. I don't know if it's I don't know. I guess like it's something that you would have to ask celebrities, right? Because I'm not there yet, so I don't know. But it's definitely hard. It would be hard for me. Like if I like abruptly got that kind of like success, I can kind of see how I would let it get in. Like if I jump from, let's say, 20 years ago to now, like overnight, like one thing I didn't say is like my ego used to be through the roof. Like
really?
Yeah, like 10, 15 years ago. And running a business really humbled me. Like, and it was a repetitive thing. Like when you keeps getting stomped over and over and over and over and over, when you think you're right, like it's that's a humbling experience. But it had to happen over time.
Yeah.
So I don't know if like if it happened all of a sudden, like I would be ready for it. Like maybe now I understand that, so maybe it'll be different for me now that I've already went through this experience.
Yeah.
But I think it has a lot to do with ego, right? Like
yeah. I mean, I think ultimately a lot of it comes back to our ego, whether alter ego or just ego, right? So, question, you've been in the personal branding space for a minute. You are one and you've worked with big ones. Moving forward, what is like the state of the union? Like what is it that you predict or see for those that desire to be successful, visible personal brands?
Like what I'm starting to see is like when you meet somebody and they don't even have to be a personal brand. They could be, like just a friend of a friend or something like that. Usually when you meet somebody and sometimes you feel this spark or you feel some sort of like, oh, this person is different, right?
Yeah.
There's something there. And I actually think, like, I don't know that words can express that, but I think there's something to that, because like even before I started growing my personal brand, like I've always had this ability to attract people, like in my agency, in my friend groups and things like that, right? So maybe there's like actually this is the first time I'm talking about this, so I don't even know, maybe I'm just pulling this out of my ass, but maybe there's something there.
This is like therapy. Tell me.
But another thing is, like, you ever seen this like video of this like two British girls, like young girls, and they're like, so there's this ice cream over here that's charging £2. Like it's like a viral video of this, and they're like so hilarious. And what I was thinking was, when we're young, right? Like when we're like 6 years old, we don't really think about validation. We don't really think about, like being liked. Like I think that's like we're literally ourselves, being ourselves without any care for the world. And I think that's when we're the most charming. Like that's when we're automatically like drawing people in. And I think that's why, when you ever have friends where you're like they keep going on these dates and they can't nobody seems to like them, and people are like, they just don't know you like we do, right? Well, the reason why they don't know you like we do is because you're being completely yourself in front of your best friends. But then as soon as you go on a first date, or as soon as you go on an interview, and as soon as you're like you freeze up. And I've seen this actually in my community, where there's this girl who was telling me this like elaborate story, and she was like acting it out, and she was like so charismatic. And then I told her to tell the same exact story on Sunday service, which is like our community meeting. And she kind of froze up, and she like missed the best parts. And there's something about that, right? Where I just feel like everyone has this charisma that are able to attract people, and that's why they have friends, right? That's what their friends like. But for some reason, like, we can't do it in public. And I think that's actually a secret sauce right there. Like, if you are able to let yourself out completely, your raw self like that, that the people that love you see out in public, I actually think, like, their Instagram will start growing like crazy.
Is this why you're so passionate about storytelling? Because that, I think, to me, one of the best vehicles for that conversion between who I am with my most loved and safe ones, and then with people who are free to judge and criticize and I don't know, and they can hide behind their keyboards. It's the perfect vehicle is the gift of a story, and being to articulate it, to perform it, to give it its little nuances and timing and beats. Is that why you're so passionate about storytelling? Because that's really like what you're now helping so many do.
Yeah, that's like, I would say that's half of it. Half of it is exactly that, right? Like, when somebody knows you personally, your story, I mean, you want to buy from your friends. Like, you feel like you know them, and there's something that draws you to them. And the other half is, I think I look at story as an analogy for a lesson. So, like, I remember, like, when I first started my agency, I would do these meetings with my team, and then I would say something, and I'll say, any questions, and nobody will raise their hands, right? And then afterwards, like, I realized that they did have questions, they just didn't raise their, like, I'm like, why didn't you say something in the meeting or something like that? So what ended up happening is I built this habit of saying something, like, for example, like, here's why storytelling is, like, I would say something like, I think I did a few times in this, probably called, like, using an analogy to, like, here's why you need to be authentic, right? For example, if you go out with your friends and you're with your best friend, you're completely being yourself, but when you go on a date, like, I did that, right? So I built this habit of saying, for example. Like, I'll say a statement, I'll give an advice, and I'll say, for example, and then I'll tell a story, or I'll give an analogy for that. And to me, because every time I did that, I would say something to my team, and then I'll say, for example, and then I say something. Afterwards, I like literally see their eyes light up, and they're like, oh, I get it now. I get it. Like, I literally don't think that people understand what you're saying until you give them an example.
Yeah, I would agree.
And that's what a story is. And that's why, like, I think storytelling is, it's kind of like the Bible. Like, the Bible is a bunch of stories that are example
totally
for the lessons.
Totally. Well, it's honestly I didn't identify as an author or a book writer. I'm more of an orator. Like, I like to speak versus write. But the reason that I wrote my new book is because of all the stories that I had seen a through line through, right? Like, oh, and then Barbie and Harley and this and that. And it was all, as a marketer, you observe marketing in the wild at all times. Like, I'm always seeing marketing in everything. And it was just all of these really fun marketing stories for me.
Yeah.
Yes. And then I'm like, oh shit. Like, this is how I do my own marketing. I don't emphasize buy for me. I emphasize, like, become something. It's more of an identity based marketing than it is an outcomes based marketing. Oh, and here's an example, and here's an example. And so it was actually this culmination of stories and my own work that I saw that red thread through the maze. And then it became a book. And I didn't know that that's how a book would come out. Like, I didn't know how people write books, but that's just how it happened for me, was the gift of stories.
Yeah. Well, can you elaborate on what you mean by, like, identity-based marketing?
Yeah. So the book is called Identity Marketing, and the emphasis is, we, at least certainly right now and moving forward, people are tired of being pitch slapped. Like, buy this, final chance, order now, last, while supplies last. It's just a lot of pushing to buy. And really what we should be inviting people is to be this, become this. And this is why you see things like Swifties and Harley Hogs and the anthill from Red Ant's Pants and like these, like people are literally buried in Harley Davidson caskets. That's how integrated their identity is with a capitalistic brand, that they will bury them. So their families will have personally commissioned a custom coffin in Harley Davidson branding and colors.
I have a Harley Davidson,
so you know,
I know, yeah.
You're a hog, right? And so that's actually when I do my keynote, my identity marketing keynote, my opening story is about a man in Ohio who took 18 years to plan his Harley Davidson funeral. And he was buried in a plexiglass coffin riding his bike, like taxidermy style. And it's the greatest form of identity marketing that I could ever tell, because he didn't buy a bike, he became a hog. That's very different type of brand loyalty than just pretty colors and typography. So that's the book. I invite people to become rainmakers, not a marketer. I want you to be a rainmaker. A rainmaker is a different level of mastery. So I was already doing it in my marketing and didn't call it that. And then I see it in all these examples, and then that's what became the book.
Yeah. I mean, it's like so obvious, right? Like, if you think about it, like you know, you can buy a car, like for most people, like what car you buy, it doesn't really matter. It's going to get you doesn't matter what car you buy, it's going to get you from point A to point B, right?
Yep.
What you're doing by buying a car is you're actually telling the world who I am, right? Like,
correct.
I'm a Mini Cooper. I'm a Mercedes, or I'm a Toyota. I'm a Jeeper, or that's that's like, so it's everything is really an identity like that at this point.
But you see it everywhere. Like Patrick Mahomes. If you like Patrick Mahomes, you're a Mahomie.
Yeah.
But not everybody's doing this well. Like Josh Allen is a phenomenal quarterback for the Buffalo Bills, and I'm obsessed with him, but I don't even know what to call myself. Like, am I an Allenite? Am I a Josh squad? Like, what am, like, and so people fundamentally, psychologically will label themselves to be included. It's like part of our like survival instincts. It's like to be a part of a society. And some people leverage that very, very well, specifically in their marketing, and some people don't. And so that was the purpose of the book.
I mean, I don't know. I don't know if you talked about this in the book, but for me, I think in order to do it right, you actually have to talk to the customers and listen to, like, you have to get it from the customers, because
you will like this. You are validating step number 1 in the framework is find it, and you find it in the people. Continue.
Yeah. I mean, I think so. We're saying the same thing. They're if you talk, like, I just recently saw a movie a couple of years ago about Beanie Babies, and how you know, like there was this like huge Beanie Baby mania, right? Like where people were auctioning, and like it was like a cult, right?
Yeah, it's crazy.
And in that movie, I found out that the CEO of Beanie Babies actually didn't even want that. They were like, he was actually suing those clubs that were doing that. Like, but this is how powerful a community is that it doesn't even matter if the brand is not doing it. I'm gonna do it myself. Like,
correct.
Like Harley owners are gonna come up with their own terms. Like, so even those kind of names, I feel like the best way, because I also see a lot of brands do this. Like, they're so detached from their community. They're so like in their, you know, like Madison Avenue penthouse conference room, trying to come up with strategy on, oh, this is what we should call ourselves. Like, but they're so detached, like from the actual customers, right? But if you actually
just
listen
literally validated my entire step without you even reading my book. I'm like, talk about ego. I'm like beaming right now. I'm like, yes, say it louder, because I completely agree. We actually give examples of where brands have issued identities to the people. Budweiser Bros, the Pepsi generation. We have different examples, and it was like aggressively rejected. So even the people will name themselves. Or if you're like, let's say a brand new company and you still want to leverage identity marketing, you can try to offer an identity, but ultimately it has to be adopted and validated by the people, or else it never sticks. It never stays. And Harley Hog is a great example that comes from literally in the 20s, these bikers, when they would win their like competitive whatever races, they would literally tie a pig to the back of the bike. And then in the 80s, Harley Davidson was like, oh, everybody keeps saying hog. We'll call it the Harley's Owners Group. They then took ownership of the identity, but the identity was around for 60 years before they took ownership of it. It's wild.
That's so
wild
smart
to me. Great story. A great story, right? Okay, son, I know that I told you before we started that Gloria is the one that introduced us and she adores you, but I think I need to add myself to that pile. You are just, I adore you. I think you're just so fun to talk to. Like, you're so good. We do this cool thing on the podcast because I've asked you all these questions. I didn't tell you the questions ahead of time because I want it to be as organic as possible. But I do like it when the guest asks me the last question of the podcast and you get to put me in the hot seat. I actually really enjoy it. So I'll let you ask the last question.
So like I went through your website.
And
your content. I love your website, by the way. It's so good. Like, especially the homepage, like the design.
Thank you.
What do you think? So it seems like you kind of shifted from like, you know, the agency side and things like that. And I asked you this before, like what made you go to kind of this, but it also, I want to get your, because it looks like you've worked with some personal brands and you maybe still do work with some personal brands.
Yeah.
So what is your take on personal branding? Like, and because you've kind of been on both sides, right? Like the corporate branding and what's the difference? Where do you see it going?
Yeah, and I think it's a fair question. Yeah, so I recently changed my website from consultant provider first to thought leader first, right? Speaker first, author, host, right? Like it's my thoughts on stage in print or on this podcast. And then, oh, by the way, I also happen to do workshop facilitation or consulting. So that's been a big shift that we've recently made in anticipation for the book. And that has made me like re-examine my identity. Like, let's be honest, like that's a big, ego or personality or parts shift for me. And then ironically, I also work with people who are in their own identity work, in their own wrestling. And I'm just going to be really honest. I think that there are very few people who are meant to be personal brands with that level of visibility. I think people don't realize, or they think they can hack their way through. They think, oh, if I just have like a video on social media that goes viral, or I can pay a $30,000 agency to make me go viral. I can do this or I can do that. And it's like, and what I'm learning is that people will literally be anything that somebody tells them to be, as long as it means I can be famous. And so I'm getting a little bit more pessimistic, or I'm getting a little bit more like my spidey sense or my bullshit detector has certainly increased. And I don't think that everybody's vision is worthy of stewardship. Like, as a provider, I don't want to work with everybody who has a big idea. If I don't think that you're the real deal, I have no interest in helping you. Because then I feel like like you want to talk about the Bible? Like, I don't want to create the golden calf that the people worship. I don't want to create false idols that people then worship when I know they're full of shit. Like, I can't do that anymore. And I think I've been put in a couple of positions where I felt like that's what happened without realizing it until it was a little too late. And it made me feel really guilty. And so I think personal branding, and I think, by the way, people are more skeptical anyways. Like, most people look for negative reviews than they do positive reviews. Like, that's the default reaction of society, is I want to hear the dirt before I hear the good. And so I think that has been, and you talk a lot about this, like the bullshit of the online education space and how it's corroded itself. It's because there were so many phonies that had no barriers to, prevent them from just selling crap. And now it's left such a distaste in the consumer's mouth. And so I'm glad that people have more of a bullshit detector. And I think that will hopefully filter out those that are not the real deal. That's the hope.
Yeah, I really love the sense that I got from your website, where you're a personal brand, but I didn't get that like sense of like, you're a coach trying to sell like this guru. Like it really felt like down to earth. It's like I was inspired by that, because I think that's how I want to shift my brand too. Like,
thank you.
I want to be less of like a coach or guru, and more of like a like I want to break my service. Like I have my community, but I also have like done with you and then done for you service. So it's like I'm still kind of sticking to my service provider, but using my personal brand instead of.
Yeah. And it's a hierarchy. You have to choose how you introduce. You can be all of those things, but wherever you're going to give weight to, right? It matters. Whatever you put at the forefront of the dominoes, it matters. And so that is something that we've done very intentionally recently, and it feels really good, So thank you. I appreciate
can kind of see like in the near future, or like maybe a few years, like I can kind of see the whole coaching space and the gurus kind of start to diminish because of it's almost like the the pyramids and the MLMs. Like it's
that's another
was good while it lasted, but at some point, like I feel like it's kind of damaged that brand of like, because like too many people just jumped on, especially after like 2020.
Well, especially after COVID, when everybody was stuck home with government money. Yeah, it's a problem. All right, son, my new friend, thank you so much for being on today's podcast.
Thank you for having me. It was so fun. Thank you for the fun conversation and letting me rant.
And come back and do it anytime you want. Thanks for listening today. If you've loved what you heard, make sure to rate the show, subscribe, and leave a review. It helps us get the Rainmaker podcast in front of more passionate marketers just like you. And if you're ready to transform your marketing from buy this to be this, pick up my new identity marketing book available on my website at veronicaromney.com. Until next time, my friends, keep making it rain.